Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's ReGen Ag Chat. My name's Liz Genever and I'll Nick Renison. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nick Renison and we're farming up in Cumbria near Penrith.
We've got a series of ReGen Ag Chats. So this is the first one on sort of making your farm resilient on dryland production, and we'll introduce Derrick and Dave in a moment. But I suppose, Nick, we have to acknowledge that this is the first chat we've done since carbon calling nearly killed us back in June.
I know.
If we remember, it was a very well, some of the people on the call were there, so hopefully you'll have fond memories, including Dave, actually.
Yeah.
So hopefully you remember it with fond memories with the lightning storms and tea-related incidents. But yes, and hopefully we're planning to do one in next year, aren't we? And likely to be about the 8th to the 10th of September. Date is to be confirmed, but we're just moving it slightly later in the year. So pencil us in if you're interested in coming up to Cumbria in early September.
Yeah, I think we were just blown away by it was just everything. The week before the event was probably my worst week ever. But the event, and it was just, I think it was beyond what we hoped for by a long way, wasn't it? It just was everything. It was the vibe, all our speakers. Greg was just amazing. We kind of gave us his all really. And it's just something to grow on for next year, which is happening, isn't it, Liz?
Yes.
Hopefully,
if we say it enough.
Yeah,
that's true. Years time.
So we don't want to clash with Groundswell again, and also the Highland show. So we're thinking we're going to do it second weekend in September. That's what we're thinking, isn't it? So we're having a meeting in a couple of weeks to start planning that. So if anyone's got any ideas or any keynote speakers that you can recommend, just get in touch.
And what's happened since sort of the last month? So you're planning a grazing talk imminently. Sorry, grazing workshop.
Yes. Oh, well, we do quite a lot of farm walks and stuff, and they always take longer. The walk around always takes longer. You can go on for hours. So I've taken the plunge, and Reno is kind of on side. I just need to get him to perform on the day, but we're doing a grazing course here just because we've kind of done this rotational grazing and then kind of going into taller grass grazing, and we've changed what stock we've got here. So it's very much a farmer to farmer day, and it's full. So that's I've just got to make a big stew. That's my next job, to feed everyone. But no, it should be good. But I just feel slightly guilty tonight because we're talking about dry weather, and up in the northwest, we probably had the most perfect summer we've ever had. It's kind of rained at night and sunshined in the day, and we've got loads of grass. But in 2018 we got obliterated by the drought. So I'm all ears, Derrick.
I suppose, and part of the reason why we're doing this series is last time I went up to Cumbria, which was middle of July, was in that after those 2 really hot days, so 2 40-degree days near me. My cousin's combine had caught on fire on the Monday, and on the Tuesday we had a grass fire that took out about 10 acres. So that sort of at the time was quite an emotional response to this. It was a very stressful time, and I wasn't at the farm for the grass fire. So part of this, and then obviously a lot of the conversations I've had with farmers in the last few months has been, what do I do about the dry? What are options? So this is sort of, and that's why I thought it was important just to put a series on. I've worked with Dave before on some lucerne, and we've done a webinar for part of the Innovative Farmers with Derrick, and so I just thought with Derrick's experience of dealing with these sort of conditions, it was just a perfect opportunity.
And I think we just had a quick word with Dave before we started. When it is dry, it can last for months, and it is super stressful, and all you talk about and think about is the weather, and that's not good for you, but it's not good for anyone around you either.
And I think, and I'm doing a few meetings now, which is doing a lot in most places the rain has started to come, and it's in June, and hopefully we've got a month or so of growing before the winter. But part of it is now capturing what decisions were made during that period and what between that worked and didn't work. And I suppose it's trying to make sure they're stored in your memory banks for if this happens again. But in a lot of places, this is the third dry summer out of 4 years. So this is not a unique situation. The uniqueness was the length of time, and it came out of a dry winter. Anyway, we're rambling. Right, so we'll make a start on tonight's main chat. So first up, we've got Professor Derrick Moot, who's based at Lincoln University in NZ. And so he's here, and he's going to do slides for about 20 minutes just on some presentations he's been using in New Zealand, and just talking through sort of myth-busting some of the challenges around soil carbon and organic matter and some of the ReGen principles. And then once we finish that, we'll also have an introduction from Dave, who is a mixed farmer with his dad up in North Norfolk. So Derrick, are you happy to make a start, and we'll go from there?
Sure. Can you hear me well, Liz?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. Okay. And I've titled this Science to Challenge Management because I think sometimes we forget that actually the basis of our agricultural systems is science. And so I look at science to challenge management both in this talk at a planet level, but also at a paddock level. So if we want to understand and be able to challenge, speak to the forces of power, we actually have to have a basis in which we're talking. So that's the basis of the information that I give to farmers. And it's interesting, you're dealing with dry, but you've also got some areas, Nick said she's been wet. That's New Zealand. People's vision of New Zealand is often green, but that's only half of the country. That's the west half of the country that generally gets a very UK type of climate. The eastern side is dry, and by dry, I mean they expect no rainfall for somewhere between 1 and 4 months, 5 months a year. So that's a normal situation for the farmers on the east coast of New Zealand. But what I want to do in this talk is just go through some of the principles about where we've gotten to in our agricultural system. So what is science? Look at the global food production and regenerative agriculture and its history. Focus on the soils component, which is a strong component of it, and its relevance for pastoral systems, and then finish by talking about the principles of grazing management and why we have strongly been encouraging farmers to just get away from set stocking, and talk about the principles of why that happens. So the first thing is to recognise that science is pretty important, and it's the only way that I can speak truth to power, because there are a lot of products on the market, there are a lot of people on the market giving advice, but a lot of it isn't science-based. So we try and ensure that what we're talking about has an evidence base. I use this photo, which some of you may recognise. It's the Challenger space shuttle blowing up in 1986. And Richard Feynman, who was probably the most well-known physicist beyond Stephen Hawking, did the investigation into this. And he said the people who know how things really operate are always at the bottom of organisations. And I look at that from our agricultural systems and say, I think it's the same. The farmers and practitioners who know how things operate are actually the people doing stuff. But we're often being advised by politicians and the media of what we should be doing. And these people don't really have any idea of how things operate. So it's important that we maintain that science basis. And also to remember that politicians tend to talk with lobbyists and not scientists. And politicians are all about winning arguments. They're not actually about understanding the truth or evidence. Politicians in our country anyway, and I've seen a few of yours, generally want to win an argument. They've got a legal background and they're interested in winning the argument, not necessarily the truth. So the argument at the moment is that the global food system is broken, that we've got hunger, poverty, obesity, an over-reliance on fertiliser and pesticides, and environmental degradation, animal welfare, and we need to have political and economic change. And it's easy to throw that mud and some of it will stick. But is it really true? Let's have a look at what agriculture's done. So here's the population of the planet. And I want you to keep an eye on about 1960. Because that's, I was born in the 60s. And there were about 2.5 billion people on the planet, 1960. And we fed them by increasing the area of arable land. And what we did was basically cut down trees. That's historically what the population has done to feed people. We've cut down trees. And in the 1960s, most of us understand the Green Revolution happened. Now, the Green Revolution allowed us to continue to feed people without actually having to cut down more trees. And so there is this issue that we have of our intensification is supposedly bad, but actually what that intensification has done is enable us to feed the 7 or 8 billion people that we have on the planet. And, you know, many of you are mixed cropping farmers. If you look at the last 2 points on my graph there, you'll see the green squares are the amount of nitrogen that's being used globally. And you can see that sort of flattens off in the last 2 points, but the population continues to increase. And so you just see an increase starting to occur in the area of arable land, and that's the Amazon being cut down. So there is this real trade-off that we've gotten to a point of our yields, particularly from arable, being increased by the use of nitrogen and irrigation. And we've been able to feed people. And the debate is really about deforestation or intensification. And this is an age-old debate of how we feed 8 billion people, how we look after the planet. It's not new. This is something that's been going on for a while. But people tend to forget that, you know, historically we cut down trees. We cleared Europe, we cleared the UK, we cleared New Zealand, the arable land. If we don't do that, then how are we going to feed people? And just to put that in perspective, the amount of arable land under cereal production hasn't really changed since that 1960 period. But if we hadn't intensified, we'd need about 4 times as much land to feed the population as we have already. So that's the planet component. You know, that's what we're dealing with. So we've had a lot of people suggest we should do this through organic agriculture, and that's been around for 20 or 30 years now. And if you look at the organic versus conventional agriculture, on average, organic production is about 20% lower than conventional agriculture. So what that means is that's fine if you can find a market. And I'm not saying anyone should not be an organic farmer. If you can find a market and get paid for it, great. But in New Zealand, we don't get paid for it. So we have to look for production systems that maximize our production. So if we're going to have 20% less production overall, we need 20% more land area. That's the reality of the situation. High yields from conventionals. And most recently, coming out of the UK, that very quickly goes around the world, organic pasture is the worst possible thing, with one of your most vocal critics quoted here in the Guardian of saying that, you know, organic pasture is not very good, etc. So there's a lot of pressure on the systems that we're operating. We need to understand the foundations of those systems so that we can defend them, and so that we know which things are good and which things are not. So in general, regenerative agriculture has friends. We've talked about sustainable agriculture, agroecology, or organic agriculture, and they were very fashionable between about 1980 and 2015. The term regenerative agriculture, I haven't got time to go into it in detail, but it was created in the 1980s and really picked up in about 2016, driven by NGOs and multinationals. So it's not really a science-based, research, evidence-based philosophy. But there's public demand, and therefore in New Zealand particularly, the government has responded by putting money into regenerative agriculture and trying to get a clear definition of what it actually is. Underlying it is, how do we feed 10 billion people? And I know in developed countries, we sort of go, well, we've fed pretty well, that's okay. But, you know, this is the underlying planet situation that we have. So regenerative agriculture, from a science perspective, has had very few science publications, less than 50. But they've been cited about 200 times. But if you look at the popular press, it's regenerative agriculture or regenerative farming are looking like a COVID curve. They're just taking off exponentially. So it's a really big space that's happening at the moment. And there's a whole gamut of people in New Zealand that are taking on the term of regenerative. Those that are at one end who are saying, we've got to stop using fertilizers and stop using herbicides. Others who are saying, actually, there's some principles here we need to grab. So defining it is very difficult. But if I put all of the data together, what we find is that regenerative agriculture has some principles that it works with. And those principles tend to be at a planet base. Here I've got them in green. So regenerate the system, reduce environmental externalities, improve the ecosystem. All of these things in green improve nutrient cycling. From a profit perspective, economic prosperity, and from a people perspective, improve human health. And if you look at those publications, when we break them down, we can actually find how many of them mention these terms in those publications. But at the farm level, regenerative agriculture has had a lot to do with soil. And the activities that are mentioned are things like minimising external inputs and mixed farming, mixed tillage, minimising tillage, crop rotations, manure and compost, perennials, and other soil activities. So I'm going to concentrate on the farm activities in this talk and say that some of these are just too big to cover in 20 minutes. So there are some things that we would very much like to promote that I think regenerative agriculture and conventional agriculture have in common, particularly in New Zealand and maybe less so in the UK, where you've had a distinction between your cropping and your arable. You know, the areas of the country that do it have been quite different. But in New Zealand, crop rotations have been a very big part of our arable and our pastoral. It's very integrated. We use cover crops and minimum tillage. The use of glyphosate creates a problem for some regenerative agricultural farmers, but not for others. Controlled traffic is something we'd be advocating. Getting soil organic matter into the system for nutrient cycling is important, particularly in cropping situations, and obviously minimising soil erosion. So, and then for us, livestock integration is very much a component of what most of our cropping systems do anyway. So we'd encourage and promote these aspects of what for us are conventional agriculture, which are being promoted as regenerative. And if you think about the US, where it's cropping, some of these things don't sit so easily in their situation. But in our situation, these are very common parts of our normal arable and livestock farming. And there are some crises that regenerative agriculture is trying to work out. And the term soil health gets used a lot. And my soil science colleagues, half of them say we should never use the term, and the other half say we should. So it's difficult to get a definition, but there's some things we need to recognise about soil health. When forests were cut down and transferred to arable farming, the level of soil organic matter was reduced. So once you take forest and create arable, you reduce the total level of soil organic matter and soil carbon. But if you take that forest and put it into pasture, which is what New Zealand predominantly did, then your soil organic matter and soil carbon actually increase. Because although a forest is a climax situation, it's actually doesn't have a lot of soil carbon. It has low soil organic matter and low soil carbon. So the key thing to remember is that soil organic matter is not soil carbon. And I want people to understand that distinction, because often these terms get used interchangeably, and it's important that we understand the difference. If you think about a pasture or a crop and you take the stubble, once you plough that stubble in, or you've got the stubble or the litter, and you can still see that it's a leaf or a stem or it's a bit of root, that's litter. Once it's been incorporated and the worms have had a go at it and the bacteria have eaten it down and it's humus, then that is soil organic matter, but it's not soil carbon. Soil carbon, as a soil scientist talks about it, is actually only the carbon molecules that are attached to the soil particles themselves. And that is the only part of the soil carbon that is permanently stored in the soil. All the rest of the carbon disappears. So if we take, for example, our stubble and we plough that into a paddock, then we will have a microbial mass that will get into that stubble and it will eat it and it will release carbon dioxide. And remember, all of this plant material came from carbon dioxide, so it was fixed from carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide plus water, we got sugars. Now, the microbial mass is eating those sugars and releasing carbon dioxide. As we go on in the system, then it starts eating that intermediate fraction. And so the microbial mass doesn't really change, because the microbial mass, the types of organisms in the soil will change as they have to eat different types of compounds in the soil, but the total mass of them won't actually change very much. And then that intermediate fraction gets broken down and from our litter, it ends up going back into carbon dioxide, back into the atmosphere in weeks or months. And then there's this resistant fraction that people often talk about, but it will become soil humus, and then over time, it will also be degraded. And the contribution of this slower composition to capturing carbon is actually very limited. As a carbon capture and carbon storage, soil humus is going to give us some years, but is already generally reasonably high in pasture-based soils and obviously lower in cropping soils. So it's only the carbon that is actually attached to the mineral particles of soil, that is soil carbon. And people measure that over decades. That takes decades to build up. And our pasture soils here in New Zealand, and I suspect your pasture soils in the UK, are actually already very saturated. If you've had a good rotational grazing system, then your soil carbon levels will actually be rotated. So the decomposition of that humus can then take time, but it's only a very small fraction of the total input that goes into the farm system. If we get it wrong and we get too much organic matter, too much carbon, we can actually get this thatch, which will stop nutrient cycling. So there's a balance to be had between having soil organic matter that can be broken down and having too much carbon in the soil, which in this case has a very high carbon level and will stop nitrogen cycling. And given nitrogen is the most important nutrient for growing feed and growing plants, if you have too much carbon and you get this sort of a situation, then you lose the ability of nutrient cycling. So carbon storage is saturated in many pastoral soils, and it's low and temporary in cropping soils. Soil organic matter can increase the release of nutrients, but only if those nutrients are limiting. The nutrients don't up well, they must be replaced. So what we remove as meat and milk or grain actually has to be replaced. And if we put the soil organic matter back into the soil, it won't actually replace all of those nutrients because that crop was grown off nutrients that were in the soil. So the product you've removed contains nutrients that must be replaced. If we think of regenerative agriculture in the first principles, there's an emphasis to try and use nitrogen fixation, and that's important, but nitrogen fixation also requires phosphorus and sulfur, phosphorus being the energy source for nitrogen fixation to occur. So there's no free lunch. If you want to get your nitrogen into the system through nitrogen fixation, about 20% of the carbon made in any given day, so 20% of the photosynthesis will be used as sugar to feed the bacteria to enable them to fix nitrogen. And the law of the most limiting says that it doesn't matter how much sulfur or calcium we have, whichever nutrient is limiting is going to be the one that affects our yield. So that's pretty much what happens is the bucket will empty, or your yield potential is limited by your most limiting nutrient. And this is seen here in an experiment that I did with corn. And you can see the corn here is not looking very good. This has got an Olsen P of 6 or a very low phosphorus level. But I want you to look at the interrow here, because when the student came to see me, this interrow was actually his biggest concern. In the high fertility area, he had a lot of weeds. Those weeds were actually clover. And so you can see from these two slides the difference that the phosphorus has made in the ability to grow legume. This is looking a bit, they're looking a bit wilted because we'd actually sprayed them with herbicide to try and get rid of them out of the interrow. But the phosphorus is really important for legumes. It's the energy source. So the other thing to think about, regenerative agriculture talks about a biodiversity crisis, but there's no evidence that our soil biology, particularly under a pastoral system, has any problem with biodiversity. There's 1 billion bacteria and a teaspoon of bugs. So there's not a lot. At the species level, there's an emphasis on having multi-species pastures rather than monocultures. And there's some evidence to suggest that that can be useful. And then we've got to also think about it at the paddock or landscape level. So, and we've got an issue with those of us that are in developed countries dictating to what's happening in developing countries, where there's a lot more, food production is actually about survival. It's not about luxury consumption or dining. It's very much about life. And so we've got to be sure that any messages that we're giving into developing countries actually make sense. And remember also that the best land is already being used for agriculture, and in New Zealand we're losing some of that under urban development. So feeding people is always going to be important. Is this monoculture good or bad? Depends on what you're trying to do. In New Zealand, we've been advocating this biodiversity within a landscape. So here we've got lucerne planted in the deep soils, and we've left the shallower soils with the native scrub around the outside, and said we can intensify some areas and leave other areas. The biodiversity that regenerative agriculture proponents advocate is from these plots. And these plots are actually growing in Switzerland, and they've never seen an animal graze them. They've been cut and carried. And so the European emphasis on this sort of thing really relies on being paid for the diversity of species that you have, rather than for the product that you produce out of it. So we've done quite a bit of work in the early part of last century. We had mixes in New Zealand that had huge number of species. And we basically went through over the last 50 years and got down to using 3, maybe 4 species in a mix. And we've subsequently been doing some work on combinations of species. And this is an experiment we've been running at Lincoln recently, where we had monocultures of ryegrass and plantain and white clover and red clover. And then we had all possible combinations of the species together as 2 species mixes, and then all possible combinations of them as 3 species mixes, and then we had a 4 species mix. And you can see once we got beyond a grass, a herb, and a legume, we never got any yield increase. And we've repeated this work with up to 6 species, so every possible combination of 6 species. And we come back to once you have a legume, a grass, and a herb, you basically have, for your environment, you have the maximum production from quality and persistence perspective that you're going to get. So we do run pastures here, such as this monoculture of lucerne, and I advocate using this, particularly in our dry environments. And you can see the animals here are quite comfortably eating that lucerne. And one of the reasons for that is that what we're trying to do is grow animals quickly. And this often gets forgotten when people are talking about the impact of agriculture on the environment. This table is one I use to explain that if you have an animal that's got to grow from 25 kilos to 35 kilos, then if it's growing 100 grams per head per day, it's going to be on the farm for 100 days. And because that animal, just like you and I, has a maintenance requirement, it's going to consume 1,300 megajoules of energy. And it will excrete 303 grams of methane per kilogram of product that you produce. If we can grow that animal quicker, so it's growing 300 grams per head per day, then it'll be on the farm for 33 days. It'll use half as much total energy, and its methane production is much lower. So there's lots of trade-offs in how we look at farm systems, and often people don't do the balance of the whole system. They'll focus on the soil but not the animal. They'll focus on the animal but not the soil. We've got to look at the total system to be looking at how we can most efficiently reduce our impact on the environment. So what we've been advocating recently is for farmers to look at areas like this for satellite farming. We've got a small area of intensified feed that you can bring animals onto to grow them quickly and get the lambs off the property as quickly as possible. But you're not trying to develop the other areas around it because it doesn't make sense environmentally or economically. And over time, the New Zealand sheep numbers have declined, sheep and beef numbers, but since 1990, our total greenhouse gas emissions have reduced by about 30%. That's methane and nitrous oxide. And that's been done by increasing our lambing percentage. So we've lost about half our ewes, but our lambing percentage has gone up from around 100 to 130%. And our carcass weight, so how heavy the animals are, has gone up as well. So when we're killing an animal, it's gone from a 14 kilo to an 18 kilo carcass weight. So over time, the emissions from our sheep and beef sector have reduced, in this case, from about 1 kilo of methane per kilo of carcass weight to 0.7 kilos of methane per kilo of carcass weight. And that's predominantly been through better feeding of the animals. We feed the animals better, the ewe is in better condition, she has twins. the lambing percentage goes up. I'm not carrying as many ewes through the winter. If I'm not carrying as many ewes, I'm not producing as many greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing to always keep in mind, and keep an eye here on 1960, is that the stones are certainly being thrown at the agricultural sector. But if we look at what's really driving greenhouse gas production, it's fossil fuel. Here's coal production globally, this is crude oil, and that's natural gas. So since about 1960, as the population's increased, our use of fossil fuels to increase energy production, electricity consumption is huge. This is globally. There's nuclear, and it was interesting today to read that Germany have actually stopped closing down 2 of their nuclear power plants. Personally, I think that's a good thing because they had a reliance on natural gas. So obviously a small war in Ukraine has caused some major global repercussions. And there's renewable energy. So despite a lot of talk about renewable energy, and in New Zealand, 80% of our energy production is from hydropower, so we're very renewable. Globally, it's still a very low component. So we've got to remember that there are many areas where regenerative agriculture and conventional agriculture see eye to eye, and we need to promote these. And we need to recognise that regenerative agriculture generally has had a cropping basis, and there's less information from a pastoral perspective. And so it tends to sometimes not, the proponents sometimes don't deal with the diversity of agricultural systems in time and space. The soil crisis and biodiversity crisis are also not universal. There are some areas where there's certainly a problem, but other areas where they're not. Fix agriculture and failing food systems are old mantras and easy to say, but as all of us know, they're not necessarily so easy to fix. And we've got to also remember that the emphasis and pushing of agriculture does actually distract from the major driver. So in New Zealand, we see this as politically expedient, but potentially offering a market opportunity rather than a solution. I'm just going to finish by going through a little bit about my support and advocacy for some of the components of ReGen Ag, and in particular rotational grazing. I think it's really important that people understand how plants grow. So to get nothing else out of my talk, I want you to remember this. When a plant is short of carbon, then its priority is to grow leaves. Now, carbon is what it's grabbing from the atmosphere as carbon dioxide to join with water to make sugar. So if a plant doesn't have enough leaf area, it will stop growing its roots and it will put more energy into growing leaves. So if I'm constantly removing the leaf area, the plant is going to be carbon limited and it's going to have a shoot growth priority. If it's water or nitrogen limited, it will decrease its leaf area and increase its root growth, which makes sense. It's looking for what's scarce. So it only gets so much carbon in a day and it chooses to put more of it into its root growth to seek out water or nitrogen. So we must allow the rebuilding of root reserves seasonally or within rotations to ensure that we have good root growth in our plants. This diagram's a little bit complicated, but it's the basis of all agricultural systems. What it says is that our yield is based on how much light we have available from the sun and how much of it we capture through the leaves, and then how efficiently we use it. And that efficiency of use depends on whether the plant has the right temperature and moisture. But most of our temperate C3 plants, wheat, ryegrass, they use energy or light energy at the same efficiency. So this figure is quite conservative. So then it becomes all about how much light did I capture? Because I can't really change how efficiently I used it, but I can change how much I capture. At the end of any given day, let's say I've got 100 kilos of dry matter, which is 100 kilos of sugar from photosynthesis, then the leaves demand some and the stems demand some and the root demands some. And the plant has to work out where to put those things. Now, if it hasn't got enough to grow leaves, it stops putting it down here for the roots and puts it up here for the leaves. So here's our canopy energy capture device. This is a Lucerne canopy. And what it's doing is capturing light. But the key point is we need about 3.5 meters of green leaf area index, 3.5 meters of leaf per metre of ground to intercept 95% of the light. So I want you to think about that. If you've got a table in front of you, if you put a tablecloth on that table, that's a leaf area index of 1. So if you've got a covering just across the ground of 1 metre of green leaf area, you're only intercepting about 15% of the available light. Because leaves can sit upright, and as they sit upright, they expose more of their surface to the sunshine, and we can actually capture more light. And that's what rotational grazing allows us to do. If your cover is short, then you're not capturing all of the available light. With lucerne, we know that underground biomass declines from the spring to the middle of summer. This is the southern hemisphere, so this is my spring in August, going through down to January. And then in the autumn, it recharges. And so we know that the lucerne plant is reducing its root volume to grow its shoots in the spring. But in the autumn, it does the opposite. It prioritizes its root growth over its shoot growth. So the carbon is transported to the roots, the nitrogen is transported to the shoots, but it changes its priority in the summer. This is Fraser Avery, Doug Avery's son, and knowing this has allowed him to set stock his animals on his lucerne in the beginning of spring, and then he starts his rotational grazing. But in the autumn, he gives his plant a rest. So what about grasses? So here's St Andrews in Scotland. This is the most intensive set stocking you could possibly have. They cut these greens once or twice a day. So the impact of that is those plants are always carbon short. They're always short of carbon. Mow the lawn every day, you're short of carbon. So they basically have no root structure. And you end up farming, or in this case, running the green hydroponically. You've got very little roots because the whole time the plant is prioritizing leaf growth. And if you've got very little roots, you can do this, but the greenkeeper's got to make sure that he's got plenty of water and plenty of nitrogen to put on, because there's not much root exploration looking for those nutrients and looking for the water. So this becomes an issue, and you end up with brown top or bent grass being the most important grasses on these golf courses. And a lot of our farmers in our hill country have this brown top or bent grass because of excessive periods of set stocking. And so their root systems become very limited. Ryegrass, the same thing happens. Ryegrass needs 3 green leaves before it recovers. And if we graze too early, we don't allow that recovery to occur. And so over time, our shoot and our root both decline, and our productivity of our pasture declines. And our farmers keep talking about our ryegrass being less persistent, but it's actually the grazing management that's causing it, not the plant itself. The plant can be nitrogen deficient. In this case, it will be trying, when it's nitrogen deficient, it's trying to grow roots. If it's got water or nitrogen stress, it'll try and grow roots. If it's got both of them, so this is your drought, then you haven't got as much carbon to fix because it's dry, and eventually you end up with pastures that look like this, and you lose both your shoot and your root system, and eventually your plant is under such stress that you're running on empty. So how do we deal with that? Well, these are my last 2 slides. From a dryland perspective, we minimize set stocking. That increases our water use efficiency, and it increases our rooting depth. We grow tap-rooted species. We use winter annuals like subclover that will take advantage of that winter season and grow early in the spring to allow us to lamb. And we use nitrogen if necessary in the spring to increase cover to ensure that we're capturing, but that we've got decent cover. We've got a leaf area index of 3 to maximize light interception. And we have flexible stock policies. So we have people have reduced their number of ewes, so they've got some cattle that they can trade with. And we identify the high yielding paddocks, as I showed you in that satellite farming, and use those for very high quality forages. In particular, using your appropriate legume, whether that's red clover, white clover, lucerne, and managing it. In the summer moist, which is probably more common for many of your farmers, again, minimizing set stocking, or you'll end up with low quality grasses. As it gets dry, and for our dairy farmers, this is a big issue because remember, our dairy cows are outside year round. When it goes dry, they have to adjust their rotation lengths. What happens is they speed them up when in fact they need to slow them down. You need to continue to graze at a 3-leaf stage, recognise that nitrogen or water are becoming deficient, and increase the rotation length by using supplements. The other thing they're starting to recognise is that ryegrass is the most limited of those grasses because it's the softest. It's the one that requires the most care in its management, more than tall fescue, more than cocksfoot, and certainly more than brown top. So that's pretty much the basis that I've got. I'll stop sharing. I'll probably overpowered people with information, but hopefully you got a few questions out of that, and you've got it recorded so people can have a look at it at their leisure at some other time, Liz.
Thank you. We'll just deal with these few questions. I apologise that I had forgotten to tick the chat function, but if you've got any questions, if you can just use the question answer bit and I'll deal with it. So yeah, that's my fault. Apologies for that. So quick one from John. What happened? This is back to the example where you had the maize in rows and you put a herbicide to kill the clover. What happened when a herbicide is used to kill clover in the maize crop? I'm guessing.
Sorry, you just broke up and I didn't hear the beginning of that question.
I was wittering. The question is, what happened when herbicide is used to kill clover in the maize crop? I'm guessing it was a specialist herbicide for clover. Yes,
it was. It was selective, so we could take it out. But it's an interesting question because we have actually been advocating, that was an experiment for the student on the maize crop, but we have actually been advocating people don't do that, that if they've got clover, you can actually put clover underneath a maize crop and you can allow it to grow. You know, bare ground is going to be covered with something. So you've either got to do weed control or you can think about using a legume. Now, our farmers haven't picked that up very much because they often use a product called atrazine, and atrazine in their maize crops has a residual activity and therefore it actually kills the clover. But the US in particular, there were some people who were doing a lot of work with Trifolium ambiguum or Caucasian clover and undersowing that under their maize crops so that they had the ground covered with a legume. It could fix some nitrogen and do some weed control for them. Yeah, but in this case, we used a specialist herbicide.
And there's some work over here in sort of undersowing maize with grass. So to try and just cover that soil and particularly with nutrient loss or potential soil loss as well.
And my question would be why that isn't a legume. So
would it be about, not necessarily. Anyway, I'll come back to that. I don't have the answer. I'll come back to that. So in terms of, in Derrick's slide pointing to using one legume, one grass, one herb, how critical is the selection of which one in each category, or do certain combinations do better in certain sites?
Yes, certain combinations will do better in certain sites, but we've really come down to 4 main legumes that we use in New Zealand. Lucerne is a monoculture or in some grass mixes, but that's for areas that have, and I'm metric, so I'm going to say 650 mils of rainfall, and I can't quickly convert that to inches.
It's about 24 inches.
24 inches, right. So 24 inches. So monocultures of lucerne. We're using red clover and white clover in our higher rainfall environments as the main legumes that we're using. A mix of red and white clover does the same as a red clover or a white clover pasture. The red clover is always short-lived. We get about 2 to 3 years. But one of the things we've been advocating for farmers who are ryegrass farmers is to think about putting, for example, red clover and timothy as a mix to start with. Having 2 or 3 years of that is a very high quality pasture that they have to rotationally graze, but it will grow animals quickly and it'll keep condition on ewes. And if they want to, they can take that for a hay crop or a silage crop because it's very high quality. And then drilling in ryegrass afterwards, after a couple of years. So they've had a benefit of very high quality pastures. If you put too much ryegrass in a seed mix, and in New Zealand, the seed companies advocate, 20, 25 kilos of ryegrass, you don't end up with species like timothy. They just get out competed at establishment. So you've got to think about how you get these other species into a mix.
Okay, and just following on from that, in terms of the herb, so there was a question about plantain. How useful do you find plantain in those dryland mixes?
In the dryland mixes, it's useful if I think about the plantain and say I'm going to grow plantain and clover. If I do plantain and red clover as a mix, then the plantain can be very useful in that mix. Plantain, red and white clover is one of those specialist finishing type pastures. But realistically, when we've been having a lot of work done on trying to put plantain in our dairy mixes, there's a lot of evidence trying to suggest that it's reducing nitrate leaching, etc. It doesn't survive. When you put plantain in with the grass mix after 2 years, it's not there. So we're not seeing a lot of benefit of having plantain when you have a grass. It's very difficult for the plantain to compete. But in dryland mixes, and I'm talking these low rainfall environments, we've got success with plantain and subclover. That's a permanent pasture that we've had for about 8 years. And the plantain is regenerated and the subclover is regenerated. But I don't think yet any of your areas are dry enough to be wanting to do that. My suggestion would be if people have got dry areas, they look first at the use of lucerne, the way Dave's doing it and those sorts of things, before you move into the plantain.
Okay. Question sort of from Legume Lover is, does birdfoot trefoil have a similar autumn root priority to lucerne, i.e. should we be managing it in the same way as lucerne? With acid, he has acidy soils and high rainfall.
Yep, and I don't think anyone has ever looked at it. So I don't think that research has ever been done. But my suggestion is the most important thing for birdsfoot trefoil is the grazing management, to give it a period of recovery. After each grazing, it's got to recover. Very easy to lose it out of a pasture if you overgraze it. So it may be that autumn is helpful, but that work's never been done. No one's dug the roots of trefoil.
Okay, and then a follow on, I suppose, from that about root nodules. So again, Legume Lover has dug up a red clover plant which was sown last season, so it's greater than a year old, and basically the nodules didn't look active. What are the reasons why that plant could not be or would not be fixing nitrogen?
So that's a really good question. Legumes only fix nitrogen when they can't get nitrogen from the soil. So if you've grazed that pasture and there's a urine patch or some nitrogen being returned, the plant will shut down nitrogen fixation because it costs the plant about 20% of its carbon. So the plant is in control of nitrogen fixation. So there are several reasons why you might have nodules that don't look active. One is you've got high levels of soil nitrogen, in which case the plant shuts down that fixation. The other is it could be cold and you're coming out of winter. And so if the plant isn't growing very actively, it doesn't need very much nitrogen. So again, it shuts down nitrogen fixation because it's not actively growing. So I wouldn't be concerned about not seeing nodules unless this was the middle of summer and the plants are not thriving. But even then, in the middle of summer, if you dig them up and there's no nodules, it could be because there's actually plenty of soil nitrogen.
So yeah, going on recently, it might be adding to it. It was the summer, so it was recent. Can you just clarify whether it was dry? I guess I know that doesn't necessarily affect it, but just in terms of a bit.
Yeah, but it will. If it was dry, then the plant also will have sloughed off those nodules. If the plant is under stress, the way it protects itself, it says I'm shutting down. And part of that process is I'm no longer going to give 20% of my wages or 20% of my sugar to the legume nodules. So water stress, temperature stress, water stress, both dry and waterlogging, will cause nodules to disappear. But those bacteria are then in the soil, so that once the plant starts growing again, it will immediately start that process back again. They don't die, the rhizobia are around and they'll come back into the system.
And there was and also the second bit of that question, was it to do with a boron deficiency or anything soil-wise? Do you think it could be worth investigating that?
The one that would be most likely would be molybdenum. So boron could be, but often it's molybdenum if the soil pH is low. So if it's if you've got an acidic soil, then it can be that you've got a lack of molybdenum available. So on our pastures in New Zealand, we advocate that people use molybdic super or molybdic with phosphorus every 5 years, just to ensure that there's molybdenum available. The process of
sorry, it's considered generally it's considered a very negative thing to have in soils because of its copper influence with copper. But again, it's something for them to look at, isn't it, in terms of just checking levels?
Absolutely. And we went through that, the molybdenum copper interaction and the problem for animals. And so we've had a generation of farmers for the last 25 years grow up who have never put any molybdenum on. And we're actually finding molybdenum deficiency on some farms because Dad knew he had to keep putting molybdic super in the mix, but the person who's come in latterly hasn't. And so there is that interaction that you've got to be aware of. But in the main, if you haven't got legumes growing, it will be molybdenum is the trace element most likely to be causing that issue.
Just a couple more and then we'll go to Dave. One is how important are specific varieties of these various species, particularly lucerne? Are you interested in variety, or do you do variety testing in chicory or lucerne, or are you
look, we do all of that, but for me, I always tell farmers, buy the variety that has the best backup. So who's your best agronomist? Because the species makes more difference than the cultivar. Okay, so it's more important that you choose the right species. Is it lucerne? Is it red clover? Is it white clover? Than it is the type of lucerne that you purchase. Because generally the people that are selling a product have done a reasonable job of producing that cultivar. Where do you buy your petrol? Whoever's got the best coffee. So for me, I tell farmers in New Zealand who gives them the best agronomic advice afterwards on how to manage that plant. There's very little difference in the cultivars. New Zealand's a very small market, so we essentially, apart from ryegrass and white clover, everything else is imported, and so it's all come from the US. If it's alfalfa, it's come from the US or Australia. Everything else is pretty much imported. Very little plant breeding is done here.
I have Ian's helped me out on the maize point, which you've basically sort of agreed that it's to do with a lot of that is to do with to prevent nitrate leaching in quite sensitive environments. So I'm guessing more nitrate from clover may not be ideal. So on that, and then last question for now, Jan Ledoux. So he fully agrees with you on the optimum leaf area index of 3.5. How does this square with the advocacy of tall grass grazing in some ReGen systems?
Well, it doesn't. And so this is where you run into an issue. And so I absolutely advocate taking off in any pasture. You have about 2.5 tons of leafy material. So if I grow 4 tons, 4,000 kilos of dry matter, and I eat 2.5 tons and I leave 1,500 to be trampled into the ground, that's going to become organic matter, but it's not productive. The taller herbage becomes, the more fiber it has. You can still put animals into that pasture and they will still select the best leafy quality part of that pasture and get very good intake. But the question becomes, and it's a very good question, it's easy to illustrate for lucerne. I can grow lucerne that's 40 centimeters tall. If I grow 40 centimeters tall, what's that, about 2 feet? Half of that will be stem because I need structure to hold it up. It's the same with a leaf in a grass plant. The taller it gets, the more structure, which is fiber, you need to hold it up, so the lower the quality. Now, if I put animals into my 40 centimeter tall lucerne, they can eat the top 20 centimeters, which is all very good leafy. But if I make them eat the fiber, they're going backwards. And so that's the issue with getting too tall a herbage in a regenerative agricultural sense. And I've seen it in South America, where they had advocacy of big mobs and long tall herbage, and they've done low rainfall environment, they've done damage that will take 30 years to recover, because they've got so much carbon that they will never break it down. It's a low rainfall environment. So what's happened to many of our regenerative farmers who went into a regenerative concept is they've realized what this means is leaving higher residuals, but also going in at a higher cover, but not extreme. So they've come back from the original concept that was brought to them from the US, and have come down to, my hands are struggling to lift it off the page, but they've come down to, this sort of grazing management, very much what our dairy farmers would be doing in their rotational grazing. They've come back to that management as being important. The key component being leaving some residual so that you have some leaf area to recover quickly, rather than grazing it very hard and taking it all off.
Okay. We will come back to that, but I'm just conscious of Dave. So I'm going to introduce Dave, or he can introduce himself. Dave, tell us about yourself.
What do you want to know? Yeah, so I farm with Dad up in northwest Norfolk. Yeah, we start. Go on.
No, numbers, land type, that sort of thing, or
sandy loam over chalk, high pH. We lamb about 1,100 ewes. That's including ewe lambs. Lamb, everything is ewe lambs. It doesn't raise a lamb as a ewe lamb. We don't keep it. We're a multiplier for a ram breeder. Farmed from New Zealand for a little while. Yeah, been back home for 6 years.
And so you, in terms of rainfall, you'd be what, 20 inches, wouldn't you, generally?
Yeah, we vary from sort of 26 to 30, I suppose, in a wet one, but we haven't had one of those for a while. And
you've got a mixture of lucerne on farm. You've also got some diverse mixes, but so just in terms of interested in your, particularly this year, your experiences, let's start with lucerne. How did you get on?
Yeah, good. Stayed green all year, which is the only thing. Yeah, how did we get on? So we just needed more of it, really. So the farm is basically, to this point, we've had enough lucerne to raise our ewe lambs and triplet bearing mixed age ewes. It's like high demand stock class, because in a normal year we manage with a lower class of stock on what we're growing. It's easier to manage. So yeah, and we've it's just the classes of stock that haven't. So the ewe lambs and the triplet bearing ewes have been absolutely fine this year. It's just the other sheep on stuff that struggled a bit more. We've just had to manage a little bit differently than we would have normally. We've only dropped back sort of 20 grams a day for our average.
But it's just looked browner.
Whole lamb crop, yeah. Yeah.
And then in terms of so the diverse mixes, but again in that very dry, that very hot dry, they struggled as well or some species.
Yeah, legumes sort of kept going, but so we went from what would normally be sort of 2 to 3 day shifts, sort of 25-day round, to 1 or 2 day shifts and a 35 to 45 day round. That would be what we would normally do on the lucerne, where we start set stocks, like Derrick was saying, for lambing, and then it's just a catch up while it's growing fast in the spring, hoping it doesn't get away from us too much. But yeah, so, and then we just it sort of happens organically, but with the Lucerne, we sort of extend by a day each round, 8 paddocks, 3-day shifts to start with, then 4, then 5, it just sort of happens. So it gets its rest in the autumn without sort of really trying. Benefit of that is you're weaning ewes that are in good nick, so you don't have to sort of prioritize feed for them. But yeah, with the multi-species, grass browned off in mid-June with us this year. And then the herbs started to slow down and the red and white clover sort of kept going, but it was the first thing to respond as soon as we got rain.
So do you mean it's been what, 3 weeks since significant rain, hasn't it? You had a lot. So yeah, so everything's now mainly recovered,
flying now.
Okay. And Lucerne wise, so the field we did the trial with, or you did the trial with, that's going into wheat, isn't it, this year? But you are establishing
potentially
bigger areas.
It might be a change of plan because it seems to have. I was thinking that it was getting a bit sparse, but it actually looks all right. So we might leave it in for another year. We've put another 18 hectares of Lucerne in. Rotationally, we would put more in, but it's just got to fit in with the arable and everything else, and we will get there.
And I suppose Derrick, sorry, it was Derrick's point about satellite farming. Just a quick question for Dave before I go, in terms of what proportion of your farm area or grazing area is in these more specialist crops? I have to do some maths.
It's kind of, yeah, but it's a kind of tricky answer from where we've come from. So when I came home, we didn't have any livestock integrated into the algal rotation. Soil's pretty depleted. We were essentially losing our topsoil on the top of our hills, and you could see that when we were still ploughing at the top of the hill, that deepest furrow was curling over white chalk, and at the bottom of the hill it wasn't. So we've probably got, from where we will be in 5 to 10 years time, I guess we've got an inflated amount of pasture and animals in the rotation, just because we're trying to get things to a place where we can reduce cultivation and yeah. But at the moment, so to answer your question, what do we got? It would be about 2/5.
2/5.
40%. Yeah.
Okay. But it's sort of supercharging your
pretty
rotation.
Unscientific.
Right?
It's just happened. Yeah.
But this is supercharging, isn't it? So potentially you'll drop that area, those
but
areas
maybe
might drop.
Just depends where the money leads us as to whether growing corn or lambs or beef or what proportion it is, and the efficiency between the period of time we need to be in pasture and period of time we need to be in cereals before we start to see it dropping away again, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Derrick, I interrupted you.
No, look, I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that Dave made, because I think they're really well made. He's got his triplets on his Lucerne. He's got his young livestock on his Lucerne, and that's 2 very important classes of stock to be on there. So it's not just having a specialist crop, it's also what you do with it. So having the triplets, they're trying to feed 3, so that's a pretty important thing. Your ewe lambs, you probably can't really emphasize how important it is to have those, if they're rearing a lamb, they're still growing themselves. So it's important that they can continue to grow, and they'll only do that if they're on Lucerne. And so we call those hoggets. But to be able to mate hoggets, to be able to mate ewe lambs, they have to be on good quality feed their whole life. So that's what's happened in our systems, like the Fraser Avery, Doug Avery's property that I showed you. Those lambs are born on Lucerne. They only eat Lucerne, so they can be mated as hoggets, and then they're on Lucerne again as they're lambing. The other point Dave made was that the ewes are in better condition when they come off at weaning. And that's really important in a dry system, because often we sacrifice the ewe for the lamb. So you end up trying to grow the lamb and stay on and don't wean her very early. I mean, she's losing condition, and then it gets dry. And you haven't got any feed to put anything back on it. But if she's already maintained that condition because she's had good quality feed during lactation, then she's much easier to manage over a dry summer, which is what Dave was alluding to. If you've already got the condition on the ewe at the end of the lactation period, she's much easier to manage through a dry period because you're not having to tupper or get feed into it coming up to mating.
Yeah,
the other part,
it just trying to, it's the ewe condition and trying to get that growth rate in the lambs. So then at weaning, it at least gives you some options as to what you can do. Because when I first came back and we'd wean skinny ewes and have a lot of lambs that we couldn't get rid of, just wheels fall off a lot faster. And then it takes a lot more feed to get those skinny ewes back up rather than just maintain them.
100%. Yep. And one of the things we find is that we had one of our ewes called a Coopworth ewe, and she's very fertile. So 200% lambing is not unusual, but she can't grow. Her lamb doesn't grow more than 300 grams per head per day. But the ewe buffers her. So the ewe will either be putting on weight or losing weight, depending on the legume content of the pastures during lactation. And so we couldn't push her lambs to grow more than 300 grams per head per day. But if there was more feed or more legume available, then she stayed in much better condition. If there was less, she actually lost condition before we saw a drop in the lamb growth rate. So she's sacrificing her condition the whole time to try and maintain the maximum growth of the lamb. And that's the bit that, from a systems perspective, you don't see immediately until you've had the experience that Dave's had, which is, oh, these ewes are actually in good condition when I get to weaning. They're not skinny ewes that I'm having to put condition on. And that's a really important point of having a high legume diet during lactation.
And since we've been having the ewe lambs on the Lucerne, we've got about 30% higher scanning in the two tooths.
Derrick, you've mentioned Doug Avery a few times. Can you just tell us the story that we spoke about the other night? Because I know he came over here, actually talked in Penrith when he did this resilient farmer tour. And I guess there's people on the call who are familiar with him, but can you just tell us that story?
Which part do you want, Nick?
Well, a brief bit of all of it.
A brief bit. I was a young lecturer. I was doing a series of Lucerne talks. I ended up in a vineyard. It was very hot. At the end of the talk, most people left, but about 20 of them approached me, and I thought, I'm going to get eaten here. And there was one really agitated farmer to my left. And so I went round and answered all the questions to everybody else because this agitated guy was really going to have a piece of me. And so they could all leave. And then this guy looked at me and he said, so you want me to graze Lucerne? And I said, yes, I want you to graze Lucerne. And he said, we've been grazing Lucerne, we've been growing Lucerne all our lives. We haven't been grazing it with ewes and lambs. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And about 5 years later, I was in Marlborough, and my mother-in-law said to me, oh, I've just met this farmer, you know. It's a guy called Doug Avery. He said you saved his life. Now, this is very good for my status with my mother-in-law. I sort of went up a few notches at this point. And I rang Doug and said, hi, I'm Derrick Moot. And he then invited me out to the farm, and we started dealing with some of the issues that he had with his Lucerne. It hadn't been a success immediately. I mean, I think Doug's story is very, very empowering because he talks about his failure, that he went home, he started grazing Lucerne, he had used dye, and they got bloat and they got red gut, and he did everything possible wrong. And his wife was the key, really. She's the hero of that story. He said, I want to leave the farm. She said, no, you just dig a bigger hole, get rid of them and get back out there. And so over the next 10 years, whenever I went and visited my in-laws, my wife and the children would go and visit the in-laws, and I'd go out to Doug's farm and we'd sort out what his challenges were and questions were. And I'd go back and do a bit of research, or I'd give him the answers to what he was seeing on farm. I give him the scientific reason for why what he was doing was working or why what he was doing wasn't working. And so then he went out and promoted the system because he said, I've had all this free advice. It's worked for me. It should be able to work for a lot of other people.
So why wasn't he grazing it? What?
Well, he was, but most New Zealand farmers had been told that you don't graze lucerne until it gets to 10% flowering. And that was what the management was when I came back. I actually spent 2 years in Britain in the early 90s, and I worked on climate change. And I came back to New Zealand and no one was growing lucerne, and I tried to work out why. And it was essentially because although it grew very well, it was always cut and carried. So they cut it, they made it into hay, they cut it, and then they'd feed it to those ewes that Dave's trying to, his skinny ewes he's trying to put weight on through the summer. And I'm going, why aren't they grazing it? And it was because they're waiting for 10% flowering. And so we took the plant to pieces. We dug the roots, we looked at the whole plant and what it was doing. And we worked out that all our management had come from the US cut and carry system. So, you know, they grow alfalfa, they cut it, they send it to the dairy sheds in the Midwest, or they put it on a boat and send it to China. But there's very little direct feeding of it. So that's when we went in and said, okay, actually, this can be a major feed source for you in spring. And, you know, Dave has had the benefit of that because he started off by going, I can set stock my lucerne at lambing. Well, it took us 10 years to be confident enough to do that when I said, actually, I think we can do this. Because as farmers like Doug got more and more lucerne on their property, there was less and less area to lamb onto. So we had to put a light stocking rate on the lucerne, and we had to get onto it earlier than we'd ever gotten onto it. And as Dave indicated, you know, when it gets going in the spring, it really gets going. So you've got to have a power of animals to be able to eat it. So, you know, it took us probably 5 or 6 years to really nut out all of the management challenges that Doug was having with doing it before he became incredible, you know, really successful in doing so. We had to work out all of his questions, animal health issues. I had to become an expert in areas that I didn't have any expertise. But most of it came down to management. And I think that's a key message. You know, my key message for you is you can grow more pasture if you rotationally graze. It's not a new widget. And I think a lot of us tend to try and we give responsibility to the seed merchant or to the FERT rep or whoever else by saying, give me a product that's going to do X, Y, and Z, when actually most of the change we can make on farm is to do with our own management. And our successful farmers are good managers. They're good feeders of pasture to livestock, and they seek out good people to give them good advice, but they are good grazing managers.
Thanks, Derek. There's just a few. Sorry, Nick.
No,
Go. Couple of quick fire questions on lucerne. Can lucerne be grazed by cattle successfully in the UK? Most seem to be silage with a little bit of sheep grazing. So we saw a picture of some cattle grazing lucerne.
And that's why I put that picture in, because I know it causes angst. There are farmers in New Zealand that have put cattle onto lucerne, had a couple die, and will never do it again. There are others that are doing it successfully. It comes down to management and understanding what the risks were. What I always say to people is all of the dairy cows and all of the beef cows in South America are grazing lucerne. That is the main feed source for all of their livestock production. That's how they feed them. They then, you know, some of them end up in feedlots, but yes, you can direct feed. There are other animal health issues that go with it. So when Doug or Fraser is putting cattle into lucerne, if it's very early in spring and it's very lush, they may mow. So just go in ahead of the animals and mow 30% of the paddock, so that the animals can't gorge. So you make sure they're full when they go into a paddock. You shift them a half a day earlier than you think you should shift them, not a half a day later, because if they're hungry, they'll go in and they'll gorge. And Salt is important. Dave, do you have salt available to your
Yeah,
sheep?
yeah. Use mineralized salt and like Himalayan pink salt. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the sheep don't care whether it's Himalayan pink or
Just keep
mineral.
throwing it at them as much.
Just keep putting salt out there because lucerne stores sodium in its roots. Therefore, it's important that sodium is made available to the animals at the same time. So yes, you can graze cattle on lucerne, but it's knowing the animal health issues and how to deal with them is the key. And the key one is they've got to be full. You've got to keep animals full and shift them early. And then
Do they put
rotation.
anti-bloating additives in the water or boluses or anything?
Yeah, they can. Sometimes they'll do both. But, on the property that I showed you with that photo was those cattle probably had a bolus. Okay, they're older cattle, they're heavy, they probably got a bolus. I've got dairy farmers that have got lucerne that they're integrating into their grazing dairy systems. They'll put bloat oil in the water, and they'll just graze the lucerne for a couple of hours a day. So as they're filling the animals up with grass, and then for the 2 hours before milking, they'll go on to the lucerne and they'll strip graze the lucerne and then
So a lucerne paddock near the parlour or something.
Correct. So they're getting a top up of the legume component of their total intake. So yeah, there's ways around, and you know, there's ways of doing this. Management is the key to all of these things. Yeah.
And there's another question really on red gut as well. So in terms of how you sort of reduce that risk of red gut.
I'll let Dave go first because he's getting all the questions that every farmer who grazes lucerne gets is you're going to kill all your animals. So Dave, they're all dying of red gut.
So we do the pre-mowing in the spring. Once we start the rotation, we feed roughage, feed salt. That's about it, really. Just keep them moving.
And in
So
terms
the
of
roughage is the red gut bit. It's the scratch factor in the
And you do clostridial vaccination, don't you, for them as well?
Yeah, we did that routinely anyway, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we probably get into the lucerne lambs probably a bit quicker.
Derrick,
So
question.
do you have major deaths? Do you have major issues?
Not at all now. The only problem that we see is photosensitivity in the lambs. Don't see any red gut, we don't see any losses above, any other grazing, whatever we do. Yeah.
Okay, and that's why I wanted Dave to answer, because it's often a reason that people will think that they're going to get all these animal health issues, but actually there are ways of overcoming them, and he just outlined them beautifully. So those are the sorts of things that we dealt with Doug when we said, we haven't ever done a trial on whether pre-graze mowing reduces red gut. No one's ever going to fund me to do that, but it seems to work. So we just say do it. And what we're talking about with red gut is rapid passage of high quality feed into the hind gut, and it causes a lot of digestion, and then the gut twists. And so it's fatal. So what you're trying to do by pre-graze mowing is not allow animals to select the leaf component. They have to then also eat some of the stem, and the stem is then that fiber that goes into the system. So pre-graze mowing is just a lazy way of putting roughage out, but it's more important because if I put, traditionally people would say put some hay out with the lucerne. The difficulty with that is that the hay might be lower quality than the lucerne, and the animals will always choose the high quality feed, and so you can't ensure that the animals will go and eat that roughage. Although it's certainly important to put it out, I think the pre-graze mowing is the key to actually avoiding the red gut issues that are there, that can be there.
And you get a tidy residual every now and again doing it as well, which aesthetically,
yes.
Yeah.
Derrick, in wetter areas, so that's 850 mil, where pH is lower, e.g. about 6, would you choose red clover over lucerne as high quality feed? Is the key trade-off longevity?
Yes, that's the key trade-off. I would try lucerne first. If I've got a free draining soil, I would try the lucerne first, because I do have people who are 850 mil rainfall, and often people talk about their average rainfall. But what really matters is how much rainfall that you have that's what I call effective rainfall. So we have areas here that would be 1,000 millimetres of rainfall, but they get 500 mils of it during the winter. So it's not actually that effective. They still have a period of 2 or 3 months of quite dry in the summer, and they've got free draining soils. Once you've had rainfall, if the bucket's already full and you get more rainfall, it's not effective. It's draining out the bottom. So if you've got warmer conditions and that 850 rainfall environment is free draining soils, I'd go with lucerne first, simply because of the fact that, Dave, how long are your lucerne stands lasting?
We're in year 5 now. So, and it looks a bit tired during the summer, but that's just because the rotation was getting shorter, not longer, because we were fairly extreme conditions, but it was still there. But after it's had a rest now, I've got everything off it, it looks just as good as it did, 2 years after.
So you're going to get at least 6 years out of it. So my point is that I'm then discounting the cost of establishment and fertilizer over a 6-year period, whereas with a red clover pasture, we'd be lucky to get a good 3 years out of it.
I think you could manage it pretty badly and still get 3 or 4 years.
That's for your lucerne.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas,
And if you
clover,
manage, you could kill the red clover in 1 or 2 probably if you managed it really badly. Yeah.
So if I was trying in that environment, 850 rainfall, I would probably try the lucerne in a paddock that's, if the paddock's got some slope and it's a south or a warmer facing slope, rather than the bottom of the valley where, and that's okay too, but remember that's the coldest part of the farm and it's also where the water runs to. So if there's any contour at all, the warmer contours are the parts of the farm that I'd be putting the lucerne into first.
There's just a quick question on what are you mentioned the Timothy and red clover mix earlier. People are just interested in the sort of seed rates or what's that mix look like?
It looks at about 8 kilos of red clover and a kilo of Timothy. And the biggest issue we have is that most of our contractors can't drill that low a seeding rate. But Timothy is a baby seed. It's a really tiny seed. It's smaller than white clover.
Just to clarify, that's per acre seed rate?
That's per hectare.
Per hectare, wow.
So, yes, that's per hectare.
That'll test them.
So these are very low sowing rates.
Seed merchants won't like to hear that.
No, they don't. No one has coffee with me at conferences.
No free hats for you.
No, I don't get the free hats.
Last 2 questions. The one is, can you put lucerne in a multi-species mix? I suppose that links to we had a quick chat, didn't we, about the trial you've just started? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. So we've done a lot of that. We've done lucerne in just binary mixes. So lucerne with cocksfoot, lucerne with tall fescue, lucerne with brome. And in all of those cases, after about 3 years, the grass dominated because the grass grows over the crown. So there's less stimulation of new shoots to come away. And the live weight gains of those paddocks were always related to the proportion of lucerne in the diet. So in the first 2 or 3 years, there was no difference between the monocultures of lucerne and the binary mixes of lucerne because the lucerne dominated. But after that, those grass mixtures had lower animal production because there was less legume. We've just started a multi-species, as in 15 species lucerne-based system. So I've just been funded literally in the last week to do an experiment of an Olsen P of 10 versus 20 with our conventional lucerne system, a lucerne monoculture with cocksfoot and subclover as our main pasture, compared with a multi-species lucerne-based mix. And that had 15 species in the mix, including plantains and chicory and some grass and all sorts of things. Immediately apparent in that is that the lucerne struggled in the lower phosphorus environment. So that's the challenge in a multi-species environment, is the grass is going to dominate the phosphorus because it's got more roots. So the lucerne struggled more in that. We've established this pasture, but we'll see what happens. We've got a 6-year funding window to look at that experiment over time. We'll use regenerative grazing management practices on the multi-species mix. So we'll shift the animals every second day or so. So they'll be on a fast rotation, slightly taller residuals, as you were describing earlier, compared with a conventional dryland system. So
it should favour the lucerne, shouldn't it? From the spectrum of species, you manage it for the lucerne. You would think in a dry environment you might check the grass, but I suppose that it's setting seed and getting more. Yeah.
The difficulty, the short, quick rotation. The possible problem is that the animals may just go in and take off the lucerne and leave the grass because they'll eat the most palatable stuff first.
Yes, you would, yeah.
So there's a bit of, we're just going to see what happens. I'm keeping an open mind. I've got a technical advisory group of regenerative agricultural farmers who are advising us how they want this grazed. Yeah.
And just to clarify, 10 Olsen P is equivalent to our index 1, and a Olsen P of 20 is index 2, just in case people weren't aware of how that categories. We have categories that describe them. Anyway, right. Quick question for Dave. What's your set stocking rate at lambing on your lucerne?
So if it's ewe lambs, which we did singularly ewe lambs for the first 2 years, 6 to the acre. So, but ordinarily with ewes, it's 5, so 12 to the hectare. On the multi-species, it's 4 to the acre, so 10 to the hectare.
And how long are they on there, Dave? What do you call the set stocking period?
So we rattle into to get our lambing window small as possible. So generally, if we're tucked up for space, I put the second and third 10-day cycles on the lucerne, just because the quality dropping off on the other pasture for those later born animals. So we'd get them out there 2 weeks before the first ones are due, and then probably 10 days or I sort of do a bit of a passive shift to begin with. Like I'll push the sheep up to one end of the field, put a fence up. That might happen a week after lambing, if I can do it gently at a time when they're all up one end anyway or whatever, and then I'll gradually just get it started. So there'll be in a full proper rotation sort of 2 to 3 weeks after the last one's lambed.
So does that mean on the worst lucerne paddock, they might have been on there for 4 or 5 weeks?
Yeah.
So, and that's if at a low stocking rate, 4 to 5 weeks over lambing, it seems to be okay. We're managing to do that. And how much cover have you got when you're going into those? How much?
Kind of depends on the spring, because the lambing date is fixed, but the temperature. We haven't had one where it's been too short to start. Generally, sort of between 10 and 15 centimeters. Okay,
so Dave's just
20.
He's giving all the answers that that's why it's better having a farmer do the talking, because those are the answers I'd have given as well. So, the reason we weren't doing it was because I grew lucerne that was 70 centimeters tall and it still hadn't flowered. And here I was waiting for 10% flowering. I'm going, this is madness. Why are we doing this? So science to challenge management. The science is this plant in the spring is acting like all our deciduous trees. It's taking a whole lot of carbon and nitrogen from below ground and pumping it into the above ground. But in the autumn, it's doing the same as your deciduous trees, taking the nitrogen, particularly from the leaves, and storing it under the ground. And as long as we understand that, we can then understand how to manage the plant.
But if you look at it from a So if you disregard the sort of stigma around the whole regenerative brand, it ticks a lot of the boxes in itself. You know, you've
Absolutely.
got, you know, high cover soil cover all the time, no nitrogen, flat,
Rotational grazing,
yeah,
fast growing animals, off the farm with their heads cut off quickly,
good water
good quality use.
infiltration. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I agree.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've just got to just at 9 o'clock. So, but thank you very much. There's one question, but it'll open a hornet's nest. So, I might just type
Go
the
on,
answer.
Liz. Go on.
Final question then. Is it possible to successfully rotational gaze with sheep only? And I'm guessing that's from a wider system perspective, not just Lucerne. So do you need a mixed sheep cattle enterprise to do it well?
No, you don't. No, you can do it successfully with sheep. Absolutely. Yeah.
We're just sheep at home.
But with an occasional mow, or I suppose it's thinking about priority stocks or priority stock and adjusting and giving the ewes a bit of a tougher time at certain times of the year.
Yeah, well, if you come into autumn and you know, obviously during spring, priority is ewes and lambs, and then it's weaned lambs. And you're hoping that your ewes are in good shape so they can take a bit of weight off. After mating, we do a clean-up graze, so their requirement is pretty low at that point when they're on maintenance. So absolutely no problem with a sheep-only grazing. So you've got to remember, our animals in New Zealand are outdoors every day of the year. So these are full sheep farms where they're, 2,000 ewes or up to 10,000 ewes. They're outdoors the whole year. So big mob grazing up will clean up a paddock quite quickly if there's dead material. And in the autumn, when they've got a low requirement for themselves, they're not trying to raise a lamb, then you can take some weight off them or maintain their weight on much lower quality feed than they require during lactation.
For us, the key is to get the lamb growth up, so you can get the number of lambs as a mob down after weaning, so you can reset paddocks with the ewes and not have a great big group of lambs that are going to catch up to them. So if half of them are gone, so you've got a decent rest period after you've reset paddocks with just a great big group of ewes.
So just a couple of quick questions for you, Dave. How long till weaning? So how many days till weaning?
On the Lucerne, it's about 70 to 80. And then on the others, it's about 100-day weaning. But I think we should probably shorten it. But at the moment, it's 100 days on the conventional.
And at a 70 to 80 day weaning, are you getting any animals prime that you can send away to the works at that point? What's your target weight for that?
So we try and get plus sort of 330 to 360 grams a day. Found that they start to get a bit more photosensitivity going on the longer they're on it. So those ones that are 70 day, if we wanted like 17, 18 kilo carcasses, we probably could send them, but most of the time we send and that gives you that option at that point if they've grown at that sort of 350. But equally, if it's a decent year, we can put them onto something else, like, I don't know, a brassica cover crop that we drilled in the spring to finish them on that last little bit, and then put a different group of lambs, say like our bottom end out of the rest of the lambs, so we know they're going to be on there for another 70 to 80 days to allow them to transition and it be worthwhile. Yep,
cool, great answer. So you've got flexibility by having them grown so quickly.
Yeah, so if you needed to, you could dump that whole class of stock as 17 kilo carcasses, and then use your spring brassica stuff for other lambs or something. Yeah.
But your slight challenge is because of the multiplier, aren't you? So you're holding stock slightly longer than you would.
Yeah.
So it would be killable, but you're keeping it until it's moved to the.
Yeah, like our average weight of our 200 and whatever, 220, 250 tuck lambs was like 51 or something kilos.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're eating a lot of food. But this year has been good. It's given me a bit of an emphasis to get rid of animals quicker. Sold ewe lambs about 2 months earlier than we ordinarily would do. We still get the same money for them. So.
Okay. So it's like a strategic, this idea of, it's like, I would describe it as the 3D game of chess. It's like a constant movement and
it's having lots of little
all the
systems.
different crops.
And that's what it gets complicated with having lots of different classes of stock, because you've got lots of different little rotations going on. It's been much easier being a dairy farmer and just having one big group of animals.
Yeah.
Before we open that can of worms, I'm moving on. But thank you very much, Dave and Derek. Nick, are you all right in the rain-soaked Cumbria? Is this all very strange?
All of our piglets got out in the middle of that chat, so that's why I have to go. No, but I'm talking about pigs. I know there is the odd pig farmer on the call who grazes pigs. And I don't want to go down this alleyway because we haven't got enough time, Derek, but yes or no answer to can Lucerne do pigs?
No idea.
Oh, okay. There you go. And the other thing is, Liz, how rare is Dave?
It's quite rare, but for other reasons as well. So there's handfuls of people grazing lucerne in the UK. For the project we did with innovative farmers, we did doing part of that, apart from COVID, intercepted some of it, but it was trying to get that group of people together. But this year, or years like this, always trigger more people to start putting it in. So I know of a handful more that are putting it in this autumn to then start a similar system next year.
Because I think Dave could set up another sideline, Dial Dave. And then my last question.
For what?
Yeah.
My last question was: are seed companies, are the people like Derek? Well, not professors, but the seed company people. Are they up to speed?
Just for me.
On what?
Well, up to speed with giving the guidance.
No.
Oh.
Generally not. Everyone that told me when we first went down the road, they advised we didn't do it and that we mowed it. So yeah.
Yeah.
And
The
as
bit
sort of
that
Derek alluded
concerns
to,
me about that, Liz, is you said a lot of people are putting it in this autumn. That really worries me. Establishing lucerne in the autumn is a difficult task.
and
I would always be advocating spring establishment if possible.
I think for these systems, it's following an arable crop, so it is an option. But yeah, we've
probably fresh in their mind as well, just going through a drought.
And it's been quite nice establishment conditions in the autumn. But I take the point in terms of making sure it's doing it if we're still warm enough and the soils are warm enough for it to be okay at the moment. We've
also just lost our only herbicide to control fat hen or anything like that in lucerne. Well, not just, about a year ago, 2,4-DV. So for us, it's been a little bit easier to establish it in the autumn because the fat hen limits its height that it's going to get to, and it's a bit less competitive. But yeah,
we can do another session on that at some other time, Liz.
Okay.
Possibly need a part 2 to this.
So Nick, what's your key thing? What's your key take home from today?
My key thing is I think Derek is more regenerative than he thinks he is. and don't reply, mute him, Liz, mute him. And also just it's just farmers like Dave just doing it. And I think that is hugely valuable. And it's just, we need more Daves, I suppose, just to try things.
But I would argue we almost, I can't think of a researcher in the UK who's working like Derek from a system-based perspective that's answering questions from
and with farmers rather than trial plots.
Yeah. But on the regenerative front, no one is banging on our door to do it. That's on the grazing. I think that the grazing side, we're surrounded by set stock farmers, and no one said, and no research organisation said, can we come and do a project on you in comparison to others as far as water infiltration, biodiversity, all that kind of stuff, because there's no money in it, possibly.
But we need to quantify some of the heat, the argument against the heat again.
And there is a project ongoing on mob grazing, so tall grass grazing versus conventional rotational grazing, to answer a specific question that's come out of DEFRA. But that, for me, it's scratching a surface, isn't it? But it's not answering the system-based approach that we need to. It's just comparing those two slightly different grazing systems.
Yeah. But thank you. I've loved it. Everybody
else has. Oh, Leggy Lover and me are getting on well this evening. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much, Dave. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Nick. Thanks everybody for joining and some great questions. And we'll see you. We've got another one booked in, and that'll be looking at silvopastoral systems as a way of dealing with drought or more resilience, particularly on tree fodder. So can we use trees in certain situations? That's on the 10th of October. So I'll send some details out about that. Within that, we've also got someone who is studying the mineral content of trees. So looking at that. So in terms of how trees can add particularly cobalt at certain times of the year to systems. So that's on the 10th of October. So thank you very much. Before Neris kills me, Dave is having an event on the 5th of October. If you're interested, if you go to the AHDB event site, it's listed on there. So Dave is an AHDB monitor farm, and he's having an event on the 5th of October if people want to go and see his system. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Dave.
Bye.
All the best.